My Adventures with Superman is just not letting up, as every episode so far has been of almost equal quality, with that quality being great, and now episode 5 might just be the best so far, in an episode that feels like it purposefully answers my main complaints with the previous episode, avoiding the show falling into a formula at the exact time it was becoming noticeable. This video will be my review of My Adventures with Superman Season 1 Episode 5, titled You Will Believe a Man Can Lie. Like I said, this episode feels like it answers my main complaints that I discussed in my previous review, the first of which was the most instantly noticeable, which is the show breaking out of the formula that the first 4 episodes molded, which was basically the Daily Planet trio investigating something that then turns into something that Superman needs to show up for to save the day, which is the first time that Clark suits up as Superman in that episode. This episode feels like it deliberately answers that complaint, as the trio are separated right out of the gate, which doesn't just break away from the formula, but also allows Jimmy to shine on his own, as he's definitely felt like the third wheel to Clark and Lois up until this point, which, yes, I know, is very much focused on here. In this episode, Jimmy is given his own separate storyline for the first time, where he's given a larger role, which was one big complaint I had with the previous episode, where Jimmy feels like he's becoming a character who just fades into the background. The story does predictably focus on the third wheel role that was already established, and does it in such a way that, while certainly less interesting throughout the entirety of the episode than whenever the episode focused on Clark and Lois, by nature of Jimmy simply being a less interesting character in basically every appearance that there ever has been of Superman, it does, however, effectively showcase that third wheel feeling of Jimmy's rather well, in a way where I definitely feel bad for him at the end. What I didn't love, necessarily, is the YouTube channel element of Flamebird, and more specifically Steve Lombard's response channel to Jimmy's. It kind of feels like a boomer's view on what YouTube or social media in general looks like. It's pretty harmless, it's not really all that focused on, but it is something in the beginning of the episode that I didn't love. Still, Steve Lombard being included at all did develop some of the side characters of the show a bit, and made Steve a bit more three-dimensional than he was before in his previous appearance, which I did appreciate. And I will say, Jimmy's story ending in the way it did, with Jimmy going on the camping trip by himself before being kidnapped by a gorilla, was a fantastic ending to the episode and to the arc itself, and how it built upon the third wheel arc, and in how it sets up the next episode, both in the consequences of Jimmy being a third wheel, which I'm sure Clark and Lois will feel guilty about, and also, of course, the setup for the next episode's villain, who's probably the Ultra Humanite, who's a villain who feels very different from all the tech-based villains we've seen up until this point, who've all been human. Also, to that point, since we're in this area of the episode already, I will say that Jimmy being kidnapped at the end of the episode, which then just cuts to the credits, and in the credits, usually Jimmy is walking with them, but here he's not, which I thought was a really cool connection to the end of the episode, where, again, Jimmy is kidnapped, so it makes sense. All that in mind, Jimmy's whole section of the episode did a good job of giving Jimmy a larger role and a focus in his own right, while also helping to break up the formula and build upon Jimmy's appearances up until this point. But it did remain, I guess, the technical worst part of the episode, which felt like it slowed down the episode a bit every time it cut to it. This is, however, only in comparison to everything else, which was so great that this looks worse in comparison. Another part of the formula that this episode breaks is in something very specific I talked about in my review of episode 4, which is that Superman has only ever appeared in the last act of the episode so far, and I would appreciate it if that wasn't always the case, that Clark would appear as Superman at some point in the beginning or middle of the episode. It seems to me the writers noticed the trend at the same time, as Clark appears as Superman in the very first scene that he appears in, and then proceeds to switch in and out between Clark and Superman throughout, appearing as Superman a lot more than as Clark for the first time. Aside from it just breaking the formula, it's also just so much fun. I mean, talking about this version of Superman specifically, he's so charming and fun to watch, as the show so clearly understands the character, so in an episode as chock full of Superman as this one, it's bound to be incredibly entertaining just by nature of having so much Superman. And on top of that, none of the Superman scenes are pointless. This episode has a very clear focus in its Superman story, as the end of the previous episode and the title of this one suggests that this episode focuses heavily on Lois Lane trying to prove that Clark Kent and Superman are the same person, which created probably the funniest episode of the show so far, which is saying a lot. I think that the humor has been on point in basically every episode. This one was hilarious. Like, the recurring bagel joke was laugh out loud funny, Clark throwing the dumbbell dumbbell, Lois saying that she thinks it'd be a good idea to see Clark and Superman in a room together, or just Superman saying that he likes Clark. It's so funny. This particular situation they went for allowed for some really funny moments that were executed so well. If nothing else, this episode was hilarious, the funniest episode of the show so far. But there is else. It's not the only thing good about this episode. Beyond the humor, I love this story. It builds upon the great cliffhanger of the last episode that came way earlier than expected in the season, and the episode doesn't shy away from this realization, or it doesn't wind it back like I thought it might. The episode focuses on it heavily, concludes the uncertain part of it, and gives it lasting stakes, all of which was very appreciated. The show feels a little bit more mature than I would have expected from it. It feels like the consequences of certain storylines are sticking, and that's something that I love. Like, sometimes cartoons are very episodic. This one doesn't feel that way, and I love it. The way they went about this was hilarious, as previously mentioned, but it's also a very original story for Superman, as I don't think Lois has ever found out that Clark Kent is Superman without Clark telling her that, so it creates a very original but also compelling story from a character and even emotional perspective. This was kind of impressive, I think. The fact that the scenario was as entertaining and funny and comedic as it was the entire time, while also simultaneously feeling very real and personal from Lois's perspective, was handled so well, with Lois calling out to Superman before changing to Clark being a particular non-comedic highlight. This all leads into the final confrontation, which dips its toes into being a bit more of a cliche superhero story drama, of Lois being angry at Clark for lying to her about not being Superman, or just not telling her. Something like this almost always feels very forced. I mean, the hero is almost never in a situation where they owe that person the truth, and you'd think that maybe finding out your friend is a superhero would be a pretty exciting revelation. I don't love this cliche, but as it turns out, I said the episode does a decent enough job at making it a bit more realistic than it typically is. It all feels like it's coming a bit more from a place of either worry with Clark being injured, as well as a feeling of betrayal, not just from the actual situation, but also in the actual dialogue of Clark saying that he was scared that Lois would reveal his secrets as a reporter. It didn't feel like she was ready and willing to walk away from the beginning. It felt like the specific situation that came up here, and Clark's reaction to it and what he said contributed to the overall realism of the scene and Lois's reaction. I feel like I would be more annoyed by this had I not already seen the promo for the next episode, which shows Clark and Lois being together the entire time, most likely forced into a situation where they need to talk it out. So I don't really think this drama will last for very long. Because of this, and because of how well it was handled, I think it was a great conclusion to the main story of the episode, and I really hope it does get resolved soon, because one thing that this episode maybe lacked a bit is that flirting between Clark and Lois, which all the episodes up until this point have been heavy in, which fits the story they were going for, but I guess it was lacking it a bit. While it wasn't necessarily a complaint, I did mention in the previous episode that it did feel like this show was going for a bit more of a villain of the week scenario, with each villain using some Kryptonian technology, making them technically a part of the season's story while also being a villain of the week. This episode takes a bit of a different approach with its villains, as while there are these common crooks who repurpose some of the tech, the main conflict of the episode is with the more significant and at this point recurring villains who seem to have a more direct connection to the main plot. First of all, there's Slade Wilson returning for his second appearance, this time in a full-on Deathstroke suit, which is a very unique design that follows up on the setting they're going for here of a very early days DC universe. What feels off about this design from the get-go and why it doesn't really look that much like Deathstroke is the fact that it isn't split down the middle between orange and black, it's just black, which also causes it to look a lot more like a orange Bloodsport, or at the very least the Suicide Squad design for Bloodsport, rather than Deathstroke, which makes you wonder why they just didn't go with Bloodsport, who is a Superman villain, and this creates a very unique take on Deathstroke. Still though, I'd be lying if I said that Deathstroke wasn't badass in this episode. I still don't think his voice actor fits the role, but I thought he was pretty badass either in his part of the plot, but also in his fight between Superman, which isn't really a fight you can see outside of this particular point in the timeline, or maybe even this particular take on the DC universe. The fight scenes that came out of this were pretty fantastic, very fast-paced, very well animated, and very unique for for Superman in the fact that it's more hand-to-hand combat focused, with Deathstroke looking like he has these solar-powered swords which do damage Clark. Superman also having to face off against a few robots, which in and of itself is nothing special, but what did make it special and pretty awesome was these holograms of Amanda Waller and this unnamed general being present, which the robots can just walk through and they can just spawn wherever they want, which created some really cool moments, making these obviously very normal people feel pretty awesome, where they're just standing with robots and watching them pummel Superman down. And of course, Amanda Waller, or Mandy as she's called in this episode, and this unnamed general, who is almost certainly General Sam Lane, are also clearly far more involved in the season-long story than any other villain we've seen so far, as they are revealed to know more about the season-long story than even we as an audience do. They know about something called the Net Zero Day, and the general was present during the flashbacks we've been seeing through Clark's visions in almost every episode. This, sprinkled throughout the episode's story, has definitely always been intriguing, and this episode simultaneously continues and expands the intrigue, while also feeling like a bit of a climax to some of that setup, and yeah, it's pretty awesome. I love how I kind of have no idea where this is going. I love how thought out the season seems to be, and how this distinct take on Superman allows for this very distinct Superman story that probably could not have been done anywhere else. I can't wait to find out where it's all going. What we do know now is that the visions were definitely flashbacks, not flash forwards, and almost certainly from the day Kal-El came to Earth, which is hinted at through a meteor shower, and the much younger looking General Lane, who looks like he's maybe in his 20s, so it makes sense that this would be 25 years ago. As I already talked about some of the action of the episode, I might as well also go over the rest of the action, the animation, and the visuals. Like I said, the final fight action scene was pretty fantastic, but the action scenes from beforehand in the episode were probably just okay. They weren't really going for something epic, it was more so going for something comedic, so I'm not going to hold it against the episode. In fact, it was funny. That being said, the animation of the episode beyond the action was pretty good as well, at least in the characters' emotiveness and movements, but I will say, some of the backgrounds, whether that be in the less detailed buildings or background people, were more prominent here than maybe any other episode, and it's definitely sometimes very noticeable. On the flip side of that, the episode had some fantastic visuals that were really nice to look at, thanks to the entire climax of the episode taking place during a sunset. Just really nice things to look at, like Superman flying throughout the sunset, or any of the action that took place in the climax. It was all during a sunset, and it looks really nice. So in conclusion, episode 5 feels like it took all of my complaints with the previous episode of the show becoming too formulaic, Superman only appearing in the end, Jimmy fading into the background, or there just being a villain of the week, and gave us an episode with none of that in the funniest, most story-heavy, and maybe the nicest to look at episode so far, that builds upon the stories and characters of the season really well. The only things I'd say are holding this episode back are the less detailed backgrounds and some of Jimmy's section not being the best, but in saying that, I did say in my previous review that the show is bound to have a 9 out of 10 episode very soon, and here we are. You Will Believe a Man Can Lie is the best episode of the series so far, deserving a 9 out of 10. Now we'll just have to see how long it takes for the show to get a 10 out of 10 episode. Here's hoping the season finale can accomplish that.